there's something about being home, where everything's just right. We're surrounded by people we love and trust. There's a feeling of stability and safety.
And while some people get to experience this kind of home, many do not. Others might even be forced to leave their home and go live in a foreign land. We call this going into exile.
Yeah, in exile, everything is disoriented. You're in the unknown.
And in the story of the Bible, this is where the ancient Israelites found themselves, conquered by Babylon, living in exile, far from their homeland.
And so they had to ask themselves, how did we end up here? And is there any hope of going home?
And the whole story of the Bible is designed to address those very questions.
The whole story? Really?
Yeah, go back to the first pages of the Bible. Where does humanity live?
Okay, they live in this really sweet garden, their home.
And they're there on one condition, that they trust and follow God's one command, and they don't. And so the consequence is banishment from the garden.
Ah, they're sent into exile.
Exactly. And so this story has been designed to set you up for Israel's story. How they were given the gift of the promised land and were able to stay there on one condition, that they be faithful to the terms of their covenant relationship with God.
They didn't, and they were sent into exile.
And if you still don't see the parallel between exile from the garden and exile from Israel, think about this. In Genesis, humanity's exile led up to the story about the building of what city?
Oh yeah, Babylon. The same place the Israelites are sent.
But that's not the end of either story. In the first Babylon, God called Abraham to leave and travel to the promised land. And that story was designed to give hope to the Israelites currently living in the later Babylon.
Now eventually, they do get to leave and travel back to their promised homeland.
And when they did, it wasn't home sweet home. Oppressive empires were still ruling over them, and the people kept acting in the same corrupt ways as their ancestors. And so the biblical prophets said that exile wasn't actually over.
How could they think they were still in exile when they're at home?
Yeah, this is really important. In the Hebrew scriptures, Israel's Babylonian exile became an image of something more universal. It's that feeling of alienation and longing for something more, no matter where you live.
Yeah, I can relate to this. I have a great home, but it's situated in a world scarred with pain and broken relationships, death, tragedy, done by others, but also done by me.
And so in the Bible, exile is the human condition. We all keep repeating this pattern of human corruption leading to a Babylon that we can't escape. And it doesn't matter where you live, we are all longing for a better home.
Would you agree with that statement? That exile is a reality that we all experience, and we are all longing for a better home. I think this is a big part of the reason why the middle section of the Hebrew Old Testament, the prophets, is so relatable to us. True, we may not relate to being captured by a foreign army and taken into a foreign land, but we all can relate to a feeling that things are not what they should be. Though we all find different ways to forget life's sorrows, we all experience longing for a better home. Today we conclude this section of the Tanakh, the Nevi'im, or the prophets, with the book of the 12, which you know as the 12 minor prophets, which means next Sunday we begin the Ketubim, or the Ketuvim, the writings, and the first book of the writings is the Psalms. Today's sermon was challenge enough, covering the message of 12 books rolled into one single sermon, but doing the same with 150 Psalms next Sunday, that is going to be fun. Speaking of fun, I must say that for me, this series has been not only a great challenge, it's also been very educational. And you've probably heard teachers say this before, that it's the teacher who learns the most when teaching a class, not the student. And I can certainly say that this has been true in this series. And it's funny because I've done my Know Your Bible seminar many times. And I've probably presented my 90-minute overview of the entire Bible 6 or 7 times over the course of 20 years. This is not to mention my time studying the Hebrew Bible in seminary, snatching up every course I could with Hebrew scholar John Sailhammer. And yet I feel as though I have learned a great deal in this series over this last number of months that we've been studying the message of each book of the Tanakh. A big part of my study has been reading 4 separate Old Testament surveys on each book before I preach each book. But what I can tell you is that through my study, I am more convinced than ever that this book that we have before us is not a collection of religious writings. It is a cohesive, intentionally designed book to communicate to us the story of God. And it is to this story that we continue to turn our attention. And as the Bible Project video makes clear, exile is a central theme in the story of God. It is certainly the overriding theme in this final book of the prophets, the book of the 12. I invite you to take your sermon outlines on the book of the 12 from your bulletins. If you didn't receive one of those, just raise your hand and Greg or John will make sure that you get one. We know the book of the 12 as the 12 minor prophets, the names that you see listed there on the bottom of this slide. But in the Hebrew Tanakh, it is just one big book. Again, it's emphasizing in the Hebrew scriptures that it's part of one big story. In a few minutes, we're actually going to zero in on one key passage in the book of the 12. But we begin today by considering just how these 12 different prophetic messages fit together. Have you ever thought of the minor prophets as being one book conveying one message? Today we're going to see just what that message is. So I'm going to share with you what I found to be a very helpful diagram in one of those Old Testament survey books I was mentioning. And what this diagram reveals is that there are 3 primary subjects in the book of the 12. And the subjects are sin, punishment, and restoration. So the first 6 books of the book of the 12 focus on sin, and it begins with the book of Hosea, where we see Israel's adultery. And Hosea is a powerful book where Hosea is called upon to marry an adulterous wife and to have children of adultery. And see, I almost want to pause on each one of these books and preach them, but I'm not going to do it. You'll have to read Hosea for yourself. Joel continues with this focus on Israel's sin and the wickedness of the nations. Amos starts to get real specific about the sins that Israel is perpetrating. Obadiah communicates to us how Edom hates Israel. Jonah communicates how Israel hates Assyria. And you may remember Jonah in the belly of a well, right? Who doesn't want to go to Nineveh. Why doesn't he want to go? Because I know you, God, and I know you're just going to forgive these people. And he hates the Ninevites. He doesn't want them forgiven. They're the ones who are attacking Israel. So that's one story we find in the book of the 12. And finally, in Micah, we see the solution for sin. And by the way, Micah is the book we're going to zero in on in just a moment. But after 6 books emphasizing sin, it isn't too surprising that the next few books emphasize punishment. And so we see in Nahum punishment for Assyria, in Habakkuk for Israel and for Babylon, and then in Zephaniah punishment for all nations. And finally, as tends to be the way the message goes in Scripture, we move from sin to punishment to restoration. And it's restoration in Haggai of the temple that we see. It's restoration of Jerusalem in Zechariah. And finally, in Malachi, it's the restoration of God's chosen people. Listen, if you would, to this great summary provided by theologian Paul House when he says, the 12 emphasizes sin, punishment, and restoration in some unique and creative ways. First, it has an interesting structure. The first 6 prophecies focus on Israel and the nation's sin. The next 3 stress the punishment of sin on the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh, and the last 3 emphasize the restoration of Israel and their neighbors. And restoration really is the conclusion. It's really the point of the minor prophets. Not just the minor prophets, it's the point of all the prophets. In fact, it's the point of the entire message of the Tanakh. Our God is a God who restores. As we'll find next fall when we launch part 2 of the story of God in the New Testament, we'll see that restoration for exiles continues to be at the heart of the message of Scripture. Again, this message is a pertinent message not just for Jewish people who are in exile, but for all peoples of all times, because we all experience the reality of exile, of longing for a better home. I recently saw a great interview with Wintley Phipps. Any of you know that name? Wintley Phipps? Okay. Wintley Phipps traveled actually with Billy Graham for many years singing, but he's well known as a gospel singer. In this interview, Phipps, an African American who's especially well known for his rendition of Amazing Grace, so it's great that Debbie played that this morning, said of Amazing Grace, he said, "It speaks to the slave in us because it really doesn't matter what color we are or where we're from. All of us are slaves." All of us are slaves. Reminds me always of Bob Dylan saying, "Everyone's got to serve somebody." All of us are slaves. All of us are in exile. We all know this reality in different ways, who are longing for restoration. Who will bring us restoration? We pick up from where we left off in the Bible Project video.
Now, Israel's scriptures held out hope that one day God would send a king who would rescue the world from all of the Babylons we've created.
And after many generations pass, we meet this Israelite named Jesus of Nazareth. He wandered about with no home, announcing the great restoration, that reality of home that Israel and all humanity has been looking for.
Yeah, Jesus really cared about people who didn't have homes. He welcomed in the stranger. He said God's love is shown when you invite in the outcast and throw parties for people who don't have a place to belong.
Jesus also claimed that Israel and all humanity had lost its way, that our self-centeredness drives us to create false homes based on status and power, and these inevitably exclude others. We live in an exile of our own making. But Jesus said the true way home is one of weakness, of service, and of forgiveness. And then Jesus went into exile alongside us to show us the true way home.
Which is?
Well, Jesus said he is the way. His life and self-giving love proved more powerful than humanity's failure. He opened up a pathway to our real home. And as Jesus' followers committed themselves to him, they discovered this new way of being human. They believed that the real return from exile had begun. And so they would call themselves sojourners or wanderers.
Oh, right. They would say things like, the world isn't our home, and we're citizens of heaven.
And so Jesus' followers remain exiles as they wait for that day when Jesus returns to transform this world into a true home.
And here is the reality for the follower of Jesus. We are sojourners. We are those who are in exile, for this world is not our home. We wait for a better home. Yet it isn't a kind of waiting where we twiddle our thumbs and check our watches, wondering when Jesus is going to get back. Nor is it a waiting where you basically forget about heaven and just get on with your life until you die or Jesus happens to return. The kind of waiting Jesus exemplifies is one that was active, that influenced how he lived every single day of his life, how he lived every moment. Believers, my question to us today is, are we waiting along the lines of twiddling our thumbs? Are we waiting along the lines of saying, okay, well, I'm going to heaven, I'll set that aside, and now I just get on with my life? Or are we waiting like Jesus waited, with expectation, pouring ourselves into playing our part in the story of God? So the question is, how then should we live? What does it look like to be a sojourner who is looking forward to Christ's return, who is seeking to follow in Jesus' steps? Believe it or not, the book of the 12 provides some great answers to these questions, answers unbelievably relevant to all of us who are living in 2020. I invite you to turn in your Bibles to Micah chapter 6 as we consider exile priorities. Now, I will tell you that in my sermon filing system, 8 of the 12 minor prophets have absolutely 0 sermons. I look in my filing system and no sermons for even Jonah. I was kind of surprised by that. I thought I would have preached on Jonah. But no sermons for 8 of the 12 minor prophets. However, here's the thing I can tell you about Micah is I've preached more sermons on Micah 6 than I have all the rest of the minor prophets put together. And so it probably communicates to you that Micah 6 is a passage of Scripture that is near and dear to my heart. In fact, if you read other scholars, they will tell you that this passage we're talking about today is really certainly the key verse to Micah, if not a key verse in all of the book of the 12. So what is Micah 6 about? It's actually a court scene with Yahweh taking his people Israel to court. Why? Because as the first 5 chapters of Micah make clear, in spite of all God has done for his people, they have turned away from him to worship false gods. They've broken their covenant, their contract with Yahweh. Micah 6, follow along as I read verses 1 and 2. Listen to what Yahweh says. Stand up. Plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, O mountains, Yahweh's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth, for Yahweh has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. So can you see this court scene? The mountains are at least the jury, if not the judge. This is reminiscent of God calling the mountains his witnesses in Ezekiel 36. We've seen this before. But God's point is that all creation has witnessed the injustice that he is about to present to the court. Yahweh then is the plaintiff, with Israel as the defendants, and I guess you could say that the prophet Micah is the prosecuting attorney. The opening argument takes the form of some very damning questions in verse 3. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. Such questions should sound familiar to us because we read very similar questions in Jeremiah. We read it just 2 weeks ago. Jeremiah begins with some very tough questions as well. But here in Micah, my people, what have I done to you? How have I burned you? Then Yahweh starts listing off the ways he has mistreated Israel. In verses 4 and 5, well, here's my mistreatment. I brought you up out of Egypt, and I redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of Yahweh. When we read of Shittim and Gilgal, we may not get it, but I guarantee that every Israelite in Micah's day would have known exactly what God was referring to. Verse 4 is the Exodus. God freed his people from slavery in Egypt. The references in verse 5 are after Israel left Egypt. As they wandered in the desert 40 years, you may remember the story that the Moabite king Balak called upon the prophet Balaam to come out and curse these people, Israel. Come out and say a curse on these people. And do you remember what Balaam kept doing? He kept coming out and blessing the people. And Balak's saying, what are you thinking? I'm telling you to curse Israel. And Balaam says, I can't help it. God's making me bless them. You also may remember a little story about a donkey who stood in Balaam's way. Even a donkey can be the mouthpiece of God. But the story is basically saying in Micah 6:5, God asks, was it such a terrible misdeed that I turned Balaam's cursings into blessings? Was that something I did that was so bad to you? In the last part of verse 5, it says, remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of Yahweh. The first of these locations is on the east side of the Jordan. The second is on the west. So after they wander in the desert for 40 years, we read in Joshua, early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. We are told that the river Jordan was swollen with water. It was flooding. But that God stopped the water as the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant put their feet in the water. Then Israelite crossed the Jordan on dry land. And we read a couple of chapters later, also in Joshua, then Yahweh said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the place is called Gilgal to this day. Gilgal is the conclusion of the desert wanderings. It's the end. It's their reprieve. I've shared with you before this story that part of Deb and I's story is a rather rough experience we had back in Minnesota, my first solo pastorate, where God saw fit to teach me, to teach us, to depend on Him. But toward the end of our time there, Deb and I were at a conference, and I believe Ravi Zacharias was preaching. And in the middle of his message, is one of the few times in my life where I feel like God just said, this is what I'm communicating to you. And I felt God just say, Dan, you're done. Your desert wanderings are over, and I'm bringing you back. And this is my home. The West Coast is my home. Now, I'm not vilifying Minnesota, Julie. I'm not trying to be mean to Minnesota. Trust me. Okay, I won't say anything more about Minnesota. But for me, God was saying, you went through this difficult trial. It's over. I'm going to give you rest. And in a very real sense, I have to believe that for the Israelites, after 40 years of wandering in the desert, after all they'd been through, as they get to the other side of the Jordan, they're home. This promised land that God had promised to them for decades, they're there. They're home. They can rest. They can be in the place that God had prepared for them. But here is God's case against them. He says, was it so terrible that I brought you through those 40 years? I led you out of slavery in Egypt, and then I brought you to this promised land. Was that so bad? And this is where God rests his case with the words that you may know the righteous acts of Yahweh. So now, in this court case, it's Israel's turn to defend herself. But guess what? She has no defense. How can she? Instead of a defense, what we see is Israel throwing herself on the mercy of the court. In verses 6 and 7, Israel cries out, with what shall I come before Yahweh and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? God's people begin by humbling themselves before Yahweh. In verse 6, they are bowed down before the exalted God, asking, what can we do to make amends for our sin? First, they suggest burnt offerings and calves a year old. And by the way, these are acceptable sacrifices. These are what is described in the sacrificial system. But as they move on in this story, their sacrifices they're describing become more and more exaggerated. Shall I bring 1,000 rivers, 10,000 rivers of oil, thousands of rams? At this point, what they're doing through this exaggeration is admitting the depth of their sin and the way that they've turned away from their God. And then the lowest point, verse 7, shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? We know already that one of the wicked acts that God accused Israel of at this time was child sacrifice. He said, Israel, that's what the nations do. And these were some of the ugly things that the nations around them did. This is why God called them a part of the nations and wanted them to drive out the nations and wanted them to be a people holy to Yahweh's, so they didn't take part in such heinous, horrific acts. But here are God's own people participating in the most despicable of things. Yet, this greatest, if you will, most heinous sacrifice is their way of saying, what can we do, God? What can we do with our sin? But the fact that they even mention it points us to desperation. I wonder, have you ever felt that kind of desperation? Have you ever committed acts, sin before God that you just say, God, I'm desperate. What can I do with my sin? Maybe you don't use that terminology, but I feel that many of us have felt that weight, have been weighed down by our sin. And so in desperation, they cry out to God, not a defense, by the way, not a defense of their actions, but they cry out saying, our actions are indefensible. God, will you have mercy? Will you have mercy on us? And of course, we see, even in this ugly picture of child sacrifice, we see a foreshadowing of the time when the Father would send His Son to be the Savior of the world. You see, that's what God would do. He would give His one and only Son for us. Regardless, if even the greatest sacrifice won't cut it, what can Israel do? Then comes Micah's simple but powerful words in verse 8. He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does Yahweh require of you? So it says He has showed you. In other words, stop acting as though you don't know this. God has told you what He expects of you. Don't you folks ever read your Bibles? And I say that because it's a famous phrase made famous by John Mitchell, who was the first president of my Bible college, Multnomah University, where I attended Bible college. And he was famous for lovingly asking the student body, don't you folks ever read your Bibles? In a sense, Micah is asking the same question of the people of Israel. Don't they know the Tanakh? Don't they know the Torah? Don't they understand what it is that God wants of His people? Because it's right there if they just read the book. Micah's point is that if they knew Yahweh God, if they knew the Tanakh, they'd know that God's interest is not primarily in ritual, but in authentic relationship. And this is what we see next. Here's the answer. What does God require? What does He expect? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. These three requirements are all relationally focused. Practicing justice is relationally focused. Sure, it's about doing right in every way, but it's mostly about doing right to others. Doing justice and loving mercy is significant both in our relationship to God and our relationship to man. And walking in right relationship with Yahweh, walking humbly with your God. But it has to be stated, these requirements are the opposite of our natural inclinations. Act justly? Is that what we focus on all the time? What is our culture constantly focused on? Is it acting justly? What is it? getting justice. Don't tell me to act justly. I want justice for me, whatever that justice looks like. I want my justice. Who's going to give me justice? That's what our culture says. But God says no. That He calls us to be less concerned about getting what we think, what we perceive to be our justice, and more concerned about doing what is just. Believers, I would argue that we see it every single day. When we're driving our cars, what does everyone want? Justice. You cut in front of me, or you got in front of me? Oh, you're in front of me now. That irritates me. I want to get in front of you. Right? Someone irritated, just yesterday on the way home, near the park there, someone had stopped at a crosswalk and a guy crossed, but I think the guy thought that the person didn't stop long enough or something. So that car drives through, and the car can't even see him, isn't even paying attention, but he's, isn't this how we are all the time? And what are our news reports filled with? Everyone seeking justice. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's good for us to seek justice for the oppressed. But what God is arguing here is that we need to be less focused when it comes to ourselves on getting justice from everybody. Because frankly, when you're focused on getting justice in all the ways that everyone has wronged you, the only person you hurt is yourself. Or I should say the person you hurt the most is yourself, because actually you can hurt others significantly. But God's word says act justly. And then look at the next one. I guess I should get back to my sermon outline here, lest I get further afield. So what about when we are wronged? What does the text say? The text says, love mercy. Love mercy. Well, how does that help me get revenge if I'm loving mercy? It doesn't. And that's the point. Now, as an aside, I don't think this passage is saying we can never address wrongs perpetrated against us. However, I do think it calls us to give less energy to defending our rights and more energy into doing right. Part of the message that's being conveyed here, and believers, I think we all struggle with this. I don't care how long you've been a Christian, we all struggle with this. But part of the message that this passage says is, it's not about you. It's an astonishing message, isn't it? It's not about you. Question, who's it about? It's about God. Whose story is it about? It's about God's story. Whose story are we in? His story. And who is the hero of the story? It's not me. It's not you. It's Jesus. You see, when we begin to understand God's story and our part in this story and who the hero of the story is, do you know automatically we become less concerned about me getting my justice? Less concerned about giving people what they deserve, and more motivated to give them mercy, as is emulated, is exemplified for us in Christ. The word mercy in our Bibles, come on, anyone help me out. What is that? Chesed. Chesed. And again, it's that profound Hebrew word for love, because it communicates, it conveys the loving kindness, the covenant love of God, His faithful love for His people. He wants us to show that kind of love. The passage actually says mercy is really just love. So it says love, love. Do you love love? And really what it's saying here, not love, love along the lines of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Love is all you need. All you need is love. It's not really saying that as much as what it's saying is that we should love to show love. That we should love to love others, to act lovingly toward other people. You see how it short circuits our getting revenge at all? Because we're called to act justly and to love mercy, not to get justice and get love. but to act justly and love mercy. And then we see this final, again, very relationally focused challenge, and that is walk humbly with your God. Walk humbly with God. It's God who exemplifies doing right and showing mercy. And so here's the answer. You may say, well, Dan, how do I love mercy with people who have wronged me so? How is that possible? Do you see how it's possible? By walking humbly with your God. You see, we do not have the ability. The kind of love that is described here is not the kind of love that we can manufacture, that we can fabricate. We don't have that inside of us. It's only the kind of love God shows, because according to 1 John, God is love. And so if you want to learn how to act justly to others and learn how to love mercy with regards to others, then you need to walk humbly with your God, because He's the source. He's the one who enables us. And if you've been here for a while, you've heard this story a number of times. I just still remember when I drove from Tualatin, Oregon to Bible College on the other side of Portland, going through traffic. I remember the difference in my attitude. I always would either have the Christian radio playing, Christian music playing on the radio. I don't think a radio can be Christian. I don't know. But music that's Christ-centered playing on the radio. But sometimes I would just turn it off and I'd pray. And I can tell you, even listening to Christian music, that if someone cut me off in traffic and I was listening to Christian music, my response was different than if they cut me off and I was praying. And I believe in part it's because when we're in relationship with God, when we're walking with Him, it's hard to ignore doing justice and loving mercy, because He is the one who empowers us to show love to others. He's the one who empowers us to do what is right. You see, the power is not in us. The power is not in I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. The power is in the vine. I know I'm jumping way ahead. This is like October of 2020. We're going to hit John. But the power is in the vine. Jesus. He is the vine. We are the branches. If we abide in Him, we'll bear much fruit. And see, all the way back here in Micah, and you see again, so I hate it when people act as if the Old Testament's telling a totally different story than the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament's a God of just judgment, and the God of the New Testament's a God of grace. The same God is the God of both. And we see it back here in Micah 6. God's concern for His people was not just that they fulfill religious ritual. And believers, it's a word of challenge to us. That every time we come to church, we may think, well, look at me, I'm a good Christian person. I come to church and I try and do pretty decent things. And it isn't the religious ritual. And by the way, I'm not putting down, I think we need fellowship. Hebrews says, do not give up, forsake, the meeting together. I think that might be like January of 2021 or something. That's a long ways from now. We need the fellowship. But if we do religious ritual thinking that that somehow appeases an angry God, you got a whole wrong conception. Your story's messed up. Our God is a God of love. And what He calls us to is to be in a relationship with Him. And it's in relationship with Him. The New Testament talks about as walking by the Spirit. As we are in a relationship with Him, He empowers us to live a life that is pleasing to Him, not by our strength, but because of the fact that He is with us. His Spirit is in us. We've just talked about that in Ezekiel, right? That God's going to change us. He's going to do a new covenant work. His Spirit will dwell with us. He will be our sanctuary. But you know what I love about Micah 6, 1 through 8 is the simplicity of it all. God isn't at this point chucking all the other laws in the Torah. He's not saying that the sacrificial system's unimportant, but what He's saying is that when you boil it all down, this is what it's about. It's about loving people and loving God. And isn't that what these three requirements convey? I mean, this is loving people and loving God. It's what is reflected in the Ten Commandments. The first 4 are about loving God. The last 6 are about loving people. And when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He answered twofold. First is love your God. Second, love your neighbor as yourself. It's not that complex. It's actually pretty simple about what God expects from us, what he requires of us. It's the moral of the story for the minor prophets. It's the moral story for the Tanakh as a whole. And it's the moral of the story for the entire Bible story, Genesis through Revelation. It's all one big story, the story of God, and we are called to live our lives according to this epic story, to live lives of justice, of mercy, and of a humble walk with God. May we, as modern-day exiles, modern-day slaves, modern-day sojourners who know that we're not home yet, this is not our home, may we learn to live more and more according to the exile priorities we see in Micah 6, 1 through 8. Let's pray. And God, we thank you so much just for the simplicity of your word and the power of this message. And God, it is our desire to be people who recognize that we are exiles, that we are foreigners here, that this is not our home. Help us more and more, God, to recognize that it's your kingdom, that it's your story that matters, and to live the way that you lived, Jesus, doing justice, loving mercy, and walking in daily dependence upon the Father. We pray it all in Christ's precious name. Amen.